For the reading of the lesson this morning, it reads as follows. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in Him. The Lord is good to those who wait for Him, to the soul that seeks Him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for one to bear the yoke in youth, to sit alone in silence when the Lord has imposed it, to put one's mouth to the dust. There may yet be hope. To give one's cheek to the smiter and be filled with insults. For the Lord will not reject forever. Although He causes grief, He will have compassion, according to the abundance of His steadfast love. For He does not willingly afflict or grieve anyone. This is the Word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. I have in many ways lived a charmed life, I know. I can only, my first memory of grief in my life came when I was 10 years old. You see, just about every single day when I got home from school, my dad and I would play sports of some sort. He would always get done at the office, at the church, and we had the church and then a parking lot and then our parsonage. And that was my life for 15 years. So my backyard growing up was not a backyard. It was a parking lot. And it had a basketball goal in it, and we loved to play basketball when it was basketball season. When it turned to baseball season, we would play baseball, and when it turned to football season, we would throw the football around the parking lot. That's what we did just about every day, at least in my memory. That's what we did just about every day when I got home from school. But I remember one time when I turned 10 years old, somewhere around there, my dad had started a new medication. It was blood pressure medication, and it was a new kind of blood pressure medication, at least in my world it was new. And so we went out one afternoon and we were playing basketball, and being the 10-year-old that I was, I challenged my dad to a game of one-on-one. I was much shorter than him, and he was much more skilled at basketball at that stage than I was. But I challenged him to a game of basketball. And as we played, I kept running, and Dad kept getting slower as we played. And I can remember, in the middle of that basketball game, in the middle of that court, asking him what was wrong. He wasn't playing the way he normally played. And he said, I've started this new blood pressure medication, son, and what happens is my heart will only beat at this rate. And after a while, I can't go anymore. I have to sit out and rest for a minute. And so those moments where I'm not playing very hard, I'm resting. That was a grief moment for me. It was grief because for me it was the first moment that I can remember my dad not being invincible. You see, in my own mind, I had built up my father to be invincible, that he was going to go forever and was always going to be able to do things with me. We were going to be able to play basketball until I left for college for my professional career. But here was my dad, vulnerable. Something drastic had changed in my 10-year-old mind. Grief had entered into my life. Now, I know for some of you, you may be thinking, well, That's not really grief. Grief happens when you lose a loved one, someone that you have known, or someone that you lived with, or someone that you grew up with. When they die and when they pass away, that's when grief really happens. And to be sure, when we lose a loved one, that is the classic example of when grief really happens. Now, some people, when you ask them, what does grief mean, right? How do you define grief? They'll give you a broader answer and say grief happens when you experience some sort of loss in your life. And that is a good explanation of grief. But grief is even broader than a loss of some sort. Grief really happens when the rhythm of our life is either forced to change or when we choose to change the rhythm of our life and choose something different. When something that has become the usual for us is no longer the usual, and we are finding a new way of being normal, of feeling normal in the world, we are in the middle of the grief process. Now, as an understatement, the Israelites at the time that the book of Lamentations was written were in the midst of a real grief moment. Their temple had been taken away from them. Their identity as a nation had been taken away from them. Their leaders, the people who were capable of running the nation and running the country, had been taken away from them, and they had been moved over to Babylon. They had been forced into finding a new rhythm in life. And above all, for the Jewish people, was the question, where is God in the middle of this? Why isn't God changing the reality that we're in so that we can get back to being His chosen people? We are His chosen people, are we not? Why isn't God taking us back into this state of normalcy that we've had for generations now? They were in the middle of a grief moment. And this writer of Lamentations offers them words, I think, of great hope for dealing with grief. Now, everyone that is in this room this morning has experienced grief of one sort or another. If you've ever lost a job, you have experienced grief. If you've ever had your heart broken, you have experienced grief. That's the second memory of grief that I have. Was the first girl that I had a crush on rejecting me. And believe me, there have been many of them. But that first one always sticks in your mind. That's the one that you remember. That's a grief moment. Something that you had built up in your mind is lost. If you've ever had your heart broken, you have experienced grief. If you've ever suffered a broken relationship, maybe it was a long-term friend that you had, or maybe it was a marriage that didn't end as you wanted it to, you have experienced grief in your life. If you've lost a member of your family, you have experienced grief in your life. This church as a whole has experienced grief in its communal life together. Grief is a part of everyone's life. This writer of Lamentations offers us good words of hope that we can draw into our own lives and into our own experiences, and I believe we can draw hope from them as well. The first thing that the writer tells us is that grief is not something that you can schedule. It is a process that we all work our way through in our own time as our own bodies respond to grief. We can't schedule 30 minutes out of the day and say, during this period of time in my life, I'm going to be sad. And for the rest of my day, I'm going to be all smiles and everything's going to be okay. That's not how grief works. You can't schedule a length of time in your life that you are going to grieve. Okay, I've lost my job. I'm going to give myself 2 weeks to be sad, and then after that, I'm going to be positive and optimistic, and everything's going to be okay. You know from your own experience, grief does not work that way. Grief is a process. It is something that takes place over time. And as you work through the stages of grief, the acuteness of the experience grows to be less, but it's still a part of our lives. That doesn't change. It doesn't go away. It is a process. And that is helpful for us. I run into people all the time who tell me, this person in my life passed away a year ago. I should be okay by now. Why am I not okay? What's wrong with me? Why can't I figure this out? Why can't I work through this any better? It's because you can't schedule grief for a length of time and say, okay, now that time is over, things are going to be okay. You're in the middle of a process that will take months, years. Some people are continuing to work through grief 10 years after they've lost somebody. 10 years after an experience has happened. It is a process. The good news is that God is with us in the middle of that process. God does not leave us or abandon us. Grief does not happen because God is not making us happy anymore. In the middle of our grief, in the middle of our struggle, God is with us in that pit of despair. That's good news. The comfort that we find to put one foot in front of the other, even as painful as the footstep may be. The strength that you have for taking those steps comes from the presence and the power of God that holds you up. The important thing for us is to remember that we must stay engaged with our Creator. We must stay engaged with the process. Because if we don't, if we deny it, if we set it aside, we find that grief never, ever truly leaves us. I remember telling you during one of my sermons my experience of the Sunday after 9/11 happened. I remember telling you that I thought that the church pews would be empty, but they were full on that day. But not too long after that moment, I was up in Richmond. I think it was the Thanksgiving afterwards. I was up in Richmond visiting with my mom and with my dad. And my cousin came for the Thanksgiving celebration. He and his wife came for the celebration. And as we were talking about religious affiliations. And he kept saying, I was Episcopalian. Dina was Catholic. And I said, David, why do you keep talking about things as if they were past tense? And he said to me, after 9/11, I made a conscious choice to give up on God. He said, if there is a God that would allow something like 9/11 to happen, I don't want anything to do with that God. David, my cousin, who I'm going to see this week, has disengaged from the process of grief. He had disengaged from the process, had chosen to remove himself from the process. It was too painful for him to try and process, what does this mean about God? How do I stay engaged with this God who created us, who gives us all of those good feelings that we have in our lives, but also allows us to experience the bad feelings that we have? How do I process this kind of God? He had chosen to separate himself from the process of grief. And now, 8 years later, he is still in the midst of that denial. And he and his wife gave birth to a brand new baby a month and a half ago. And I know that at some point, he will have to re-engage. He will have to rediscover what it means to have the presence of God in your life. We must be people who continue to engage God in the midst of our grief. Not only because God meets us in the pit of despair, but mostly because God stands in the future and says to us these very powerful words. I know the plans that I have for you. Plans for goodness for you. Plans for well-being for you. Plans for hope for you. What does the writer of Lamentations say? The Lord is my portion. Therefore, I will hope. Grief is not something that we can manipulate in our lives. It is not something that we can control. It is not something that we can say, okay, I'm going to and deal with it now so that in 3 months I'll be beyond it and I can be a better person and everything will be okay. Grief is a process that we walk through. And God walks with us through that process. But God also invites us to participate in His kingdom, in the something new that stands on the other side of the desert. Because God's love is that great. God's love is that great that He stands in our past. He stands with us where we are. And He stands with us in the future that we are called to. A future full of hope. A future full of relationship with the one who created us. Let us, as we grieve, let us, as we comfort those who grieve, be people who represent the love of God in the things that we do. May we trust in the hope of God that gives us the courage for the steps that we take and calls us into the future that He has in store for us. Let's pray. God, our grief is personal to each one of us. It is hard for us when we gather to admit those places where grief still has a grip on us. And yet, You still call us to move forward out of our grief, to be authentic in our relationships, to be trusting in the process, and to look forward with hope to the next normal that you have in store.